Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi, and welcome to Self-Improvement Atlas, the Personal Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm Marie Stella, your host from Melbourne, Australia. Let's start the show. Welcome back to Self-Improvement Atlas, the Personal Science Insights podcast. As a society, we often reiterate the importance of eating well and living a healthy lifestyle for the betterment of our health. But our emotions often affect our whole demeanor and even our health too. So why do we not ponder our emotions too? I mean, it provides us with valuable information about ourselves and can very much pave the way for an incredible self-improvement journey. So in this episode, you're being guided by psychology professor Ben Rosenberg to learn more about how emotions affect us and how we affect our emotions. Hi, Ben. It's lovely having you on the show. How are you going today?
I'm doing great, Marie. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. Now, before we begin, what's the most common misconception you've heard about emotions?
Oh man, good question. I would say that all emotions are bad is kind of the biggest misconception I've heard. I think our assumption is that emotions are there to be controlled and to be pushed away and sort of managed. And instead, they have this really important adaptive feature that they sort of help us deal with things in our life. And so it's not that we need to push them away or constantly be dealing with them, trying to control them. But that's, I think, what a lot of people think, right? We have this conception that emotions are bad. They're an impediment to us living the life that we'd like to live.
Yeah, I've definitely heard people say that. It's it's surprisingly common that like I've heard from people in the past, be it, and not to bring up personal matters, but an ex or parents or just people on the internet as well. So that's a great preface for the topic for today. I'd love to get further into detail and find out more, but we'd also like to get to know you better. So this is Have You Met Ben? And the first question I have for you is, what do you like to do in your spare time?
I wish, Marie, that I had more spare time these days. I have two young kids. So I have a 5.5-year-old son named Ezra and an 11-month-old daughter named Mariah. And so honestly, most of my time is devoted to hanging out with them. We have a dog also, ironically, an Australian Shepherd mix, who we love to hang out with and go on hikes. So predominantly when I have spare time, the rare times I have spare time, we're outside doing stuff. We live in beautiful, sunny California. So we're hiking, we are snowboarding, we're just being outside as much as we can and just running around doing fun stuff.
And is there an activity that you enjoy doing with your kids the most?
Honestly, anything outdoors. We've taken my son, who I mentioned is 5.5, skiing a couple of times already. And that is like, I've been a lifelong snowboarder, and just so is my wife. And so having him on the snow with us, like literally brought us to tears, watching like, we got married in the mountains. We're like major kind of mountain snow type people, despite living in Southern California. But it was really fun to be able to do that. But really anything outside. We love to go hiking with the kids. My son just started playing baseball for the first time. I was a baseball player in college. So that also has been cool, just to watch him start to get into some of those kind of sport, kind of active things.
Yeah, a little full circle moment. That's adorable.
Yes. Yes.
Do you guys go nearby to ski?
We go all over the place. I mean, we have done some skiing here in California, but both my wife and I actually went to college in Colorado, and there's obviously very big mountains there, the Rockies. So we've done quite a bit of skiing in the Rockies, which the hot take is that it's better skiing in the Rockies than it is here in California. And so we actually mostly ski there, I would say, but all over the place whenever we get a chance.
Yeah, I had no idea that you could ski in California?
There's huge mountains, actually. So sort of in eastern California on the border of Nevada, there's a whole set of big mountains, the Sierra Nevada. And skiing, mountain biking, hiking, fishing, all kind of stuff up there.
That sounds like such a blast. But how
Yeah.
long is I assume that you travel by car. How long does that trip take?
It's, actually it's not that far. It's only about a 3.5 hour drive from us. So we're close to the coast. We're in Berkeley, and it's only about 3.5 hours depending on traffic. So it's really not that far. And California is like long and skinny, so we're going from the western part to the eastern part, and it's oddly not that far. You go through a bunch of different ecosystems to get up there, but it's really not that bad.
That's actually bewildering to me because we do have some mountains here in Victoria where we are based, and in order to get to the mountains where we can ski from the central of the city, the main city, it takes about, I think, a 4 hour, 5 hour drive, and that's not even to the end of the states. And it's mostly like the same plains over and over and over again just to get there. So that's bewildering to me, and I feel like this comparison right here, that juxtaposition, I feel like it's very apt of the reason some Australians really want to move to the US or somewhere else is that, Australia is so vast, and the US has such a variety of habitats and scenery that you can view within a few hours of driving. So that's really cool to know. But otherwise, are there any books, films, or TV shows that you enjoy keeping up with when you do have the time?
I wish I had more time to do all of those things. I love to read. Unfortunately I get through like 2 or 3 pages at night before I pass out from running around with kids all day and from working. I just actually recently read a book, ironically, about a hike in the Sierra Nevada here in California. So about these 2 guys who did a long backpacking trip up in the mountains, and it made me want to go backpacking so bad. I've been camping lots of times, I've never been backpacking. But I'm turning 40 this year, and it made me really want to go on a big backpacking trip for my birthday. I realize it's not very doable with 2 small kids, but it put this idea in my head that made me so excited. So I read that recently. I watch a lot of sports, so I'm a big baseball, American football, basketball fan. I sometimes catch some of the reality TV that my wife watches, but don't tell her. I pretend to be hating on it while I'm watching it out of the corner of my eye. But yeah, that's it.
No, that's so fair. What kind of reality TV does your wife watch?
Oh God, what doesn't she watch? She just watched all of, oh God, what's it called? I can't remember the name. Vanderpump Rules. She watched Vanderpump Rules, which is this ridiculous about a restaurant in LA. She loves The Challenge, which I think is kind of grew out of this old MTV show, right? I'm always kind of watching out of the corner of my eye to see what crazy dramatic stuff is going on in these ridiculous shows. Hey, I'm a social psychologist. My job is to observe human behavior, so it's a good character study.
No, that's completely fair. And I totally agree. I always hear that reality shows are for the lowest common denominator, which I have to disagree with just because it can be for the lowest common denominator, but I feel like there's so many discussion points that you could make with reality TV shows. And of course, we're all taking into account that it might be scripted or it might be edited in a way that doesn't reflect what the reality of it is. But nevertheless, it is fun to analyze from a behavioral perspective, or if it's a dating show from a relationships perspective, not from my personal experience, but I just imagine. So I completely agree with you there. What are some of the things that you've observed from sneaking a peek at your wife's?
Oh my God. I think one thing that's fascinating that probably we don't talk about enough, and you see this in other domains as well, is the degree to which people's behavior, even if it seems irrational, is often goal directed, right? So they're doing these seemingly ridiculous things, throwing drinks at each other, or like, whatever crazy things happen on reality shows, but it's often in service of some either conscious or unconscious goal, right? And a lot of times in reality TV, it's like about being part of the group, creating closeness with other people, which is a huge, important thing, of course, that humans need to have. And so it looks like they're acting in these really rational, logical ways, but I think they're actually acting in pretty, maybe logical is the wrong word, but goal-directed ways, right? Like they have an end in mind when they do these seemingly crazy things. And on its face, reality TV is successful because they seem like they're doing crazy stuff, but perhaps it's not quite as crazy as we might think,
Right. There's a method to the madness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point right there. And I feel like that's the perfect segue to lead us into our interview section. So it's been lovely getting to know a bit more about you and hearing a bit more about your life. But yeah, to start, how would you define personal development?
So to me, personal development is all about learning and growth, right? So I think it's about developing, it's about adapting, it's about figuring out sort of what any kind of change in our life is going to bring, right? Life is never static. It changes constantly. If I've learned anything as a parent, it's that there are seasons to everything, right? And as soon as we settle into, say, a new routine or a new hobby, whatever, things change. And so I think part of it is just learning how to adapt and grow from those changes. And also, and I think this is really important, learning how to deal with things when they just like totally go haywire and like fall off the rails, because again, that always also happens at some point, whether it's serious or not, like learning how to deal with those things, but to show up anyways, right? To show up where you need to be, whether it's as a parent, at your job, whether it's for your friends or family, and then also to kind of learn from whatever it is that you're going through, and kind of putting those things together in a way that enables you to just continue growing and adapting and changing it and developing, really, as a key word.
Right. And a lot of what you've just said is actually almost pretty parallel to what you mentioned previously about reality shows where there's a method to the madness, right? And then so a big portion of personal development, like what you've just said, is about kind of analyzing your reaction and figuring out why you reacted that way, what was the intention there. And so it's kind of almost like analyzing your own reality show, and then learning from there is the most important part, obviously.
Yes.
But what kind of role do you think emotion plays in our personal development?
I mean, it plays a huge role. So, being able to manage, to understand, as you just said, sort of reflect on, all right, what was my emotional response to whatever event? And, how can I learn from that, right? How can I come to understand why I responded in that way? Honestly, this wraps up with the best, most simple definition of emotion, which is that emotions are our responses to life events. And so, to have personal growth, to have development without analyzing, without trying to gain some understanding of our reactions, i.e. our emotions, is almost a fool's game, right? Like we have to gain insight into those things. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, gain this ability to not control, but to sort of manage and understand our emotions in order to really see any kind of growth.
Yeah. And on a broader scale, what purpose do you think emotions serve?
I mean, that's like a huge question, right? And it would depend in part on who you ask. And something that I think is important just to put out there as we start talking more about the science of emotion, there are some fields that are really settled in terms of the science, right? Science is iterative in nature. So you learn something, you do some more experiments, you learn some more stuff. Emotion is a relatively new field in comparison to other parts of psychology, other like hard sciences. So the science around emotion is relatively unsettled. And so a lot of the things I'm going to say are, I think, clear from the data, but it's also important just, I think, for us and for our listeners to kind of frame what we're going to talk about in that way, just acknowledging that nothing that we're going to say is perfect, right? That there's a little bit of messiness in everything we say. So with that caveat in mind, I would argue there's three main purposes that emotions serve, right? So the first is that emotions are adaptive. And I think I briefly mentioned that before, right? But one of the main reasons we have emotions is to allow us to help us figure out how we're going to deal with important life events, right? So something happens to us and the response we have is an emotion. And there's a variety of things that we can talk about in a bit that dictate what emotion comes up from a life event. But one of their main purposes is to help organize our attention, help organize our behavior in a way that allows us to adapt and to address whatever that important life event is, right? So that's number one. The second is emotions on their own are a type of motive, right? So we've all been in an emotional state, say like anger or jealousy or fear, that directly seem to motivate a behavior, right? You're hiking in the woods and you see a grizzly bear. That fear emotion elicits a particular behavioral response, which is probably, running the other way or like playing dead or whatever it is you're supposed to do when you see a grizzly bear, right? So emotions by themselves, they're not the only kind of thing that motivate our behavior, but they're one of the things that are our primary motivator of our behavior. The third thing, and I think this is probably a little bit less talked about, and I think a little bit more counterintuitive. The third thing is that emotions serve as like a barometer or a readout system for like how we're doing. How am I adapting to my environment? So being in a positive emotional state gives me some indication that the stuff I'm doing in life is enabling me to adapt pretty well to my environment, that I have the resources, that I'm doing the right things, I'm connected to people, and that, I'm adapting well, right? But if I'm in a negative emotional state, it sort of tells me, whoa, something's kind of off here. I may need to double check how I'm operating in my environment, how I'm adapting to my life, right? So there's a bunch of other things that you could say that some research would say, all right, well, this is the purpose of emotions. I would argue those are three of the most important.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And are there any categories of emotions?
I mean, again, it really depends who you ask. And there's a variety of different theories about how to categorize emotions. I'd say the one at this point that has the most support among researchers and in literature, there are different names for it, but basically it splits emotions into four different kind of quadrants or categories. And these quadrants, if you can imagine, I wish I could show, I should have written a graph to show you what it looks like. But basically you can imagine four quadrants. There are two continuums that could make these quadrants. So typically they are in general thought of as emotions are thought of as being in general from low to high arousal, and then from positive to negative, right? Or in terms of their valence, how good or bad do they feel? So if you combine those things, you create these four different quadrants of emotions. So that would give you emotions that are high arousal and positive. So things like excitement, emotions that are high arousal and negative, things like feeling distressed, emotions that are low arousal and positive, seeing things like being content, right? So get to contrast that from being excited, right? They're both positive, but they have a very different amount of energy behind them. And then emotions that are low arousal and negative, things like being gloomy or sort of melancholy, right? So again, contrasting that with distressed, where they're both negative, but the arousal level, the energy level behind each of them differs. So certainly there are people who would disagree with that particular viewpoint, but I think that's a pretty common way of categorizing emotions.
Mm-hmm. And why do some people disagree with that?
Because again, the science is just kind of muddy. And so it's not, I don't think so much that people disagree with the idea that there are four different quadrants in which we can array emotions. I think it's about how the different continua are labeled, right? So some people would say, well, it goes from just her negative to positive. And other people would say, well, the labels are slightly different. But I think when you drill down, there's a bit of agreement regarding this general perception that there are four quadrants. But really, again, it's just the science is kind of, it's messy. It's just not super, super, super settled. And even this idea is relatively recent, this way of kind of arraying emotions in these four different categories.
Yeah, right. And with something as abstract as emotions, and also a lot of the time it's without context, it can seem pretty illogical, right? There there has to be some kind of philosophical debates around emotions too. Could you tell us a bit about that?
I mean, undoubtedly, going back to the origins of the study of emotion, probably the biggest debate is it's a chicken or an egg thing. It's like, does perception of emotion come first, or is there some like a biology that comes first, right? So at the nut, the biggest debate in the field of emotional study, I don't know about philosophically, but among psychologists, at least that I know that I've read and studied this stuff, the biggest debate is about the role of biology versus the role of perception, like the ways in which we think about and cognize about our emotions, and like which is more prominent in how we experience and how we describe our emotions. Is it that the biology comes first, that we have like a facial response, or we have some brain response that dictates how we then go on to perceive our emotion? Or is it the label? Is it the perception that starts this cascade of biological responses? And people have been going back and forth about this since the inception of the field of the study of emotion.
Yeah. That sounds like such a, I don't want, like, not really convoluted was in my brain, but I think more just there are so many discussion points here. There's so many valid points on both sides. And so far, what has the research shown?
I mean, this is truly the $1 million question. And if somebody came along and could do some perfect study that would just tell us, okay, it's definitely this or definitely this, they would become super rich. So this is one of those, like, I'm a nerd, right? Like I'm a professor. This is a juicy academic debate. Like, and there have been papers going back and forth about this for many years. My argument would be that both are important, that you can't separate out the role of emotion of being biological or being more perception or more cognition, that you need both of them, basically, right? Like the best explanation is that you need each of these to offer the best explanation of why we experience emotion and how we experience emotion. So I think what's interesting in some ways about the debate is people generally now agree that both matter, that our innate, universal biological responses to events matter, and that our perceptual, learned responses to events matter in terms of creating emotion. Where they get sort of huffy with each other in the best academic way possible is which of them comes first. Like, again, like I said, is it biology first, or is it a more cognitive response first? So which of those things is the primary driver of emotion? My perspective, and like, I don't have skin in this game. I haven't written any of these papers. I haven't done any of this primary research. My viewpoint is that it's impossible to figure out which one comes first. And in some ways, it's irrelevant. Like, what we know, I'd say pretty well for sure, is that both things matter, that a life event happens to us, and perhaps at the same time, simultaneously, we experience a series of physiological, innate reactions that probably have been happening since the beginning of time to people. And probably at the same time, we're perceiving them, right? We're thinking about them, we're labeling them in such a way that creates this kind of cascade of the emotional experience, right? So that would be my best argument about how they interplay.
Right. That was exactly what my next question was going to be, was about, well, okay, if we do figure out which comes first, what are we going to do with that information?
I mean, I would say, I don't think it matters, honestly. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not sure that it's relevant. You know what I mean? Like, we're certain that both matter. And like, I hate to be like that guy, that scientist saying that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly how you would study that, first of all, in a way that would be satisfying to people who disagree, right? Who think it's the other way around. I'm not sure how you'd study it and provide findings, provide data that would show, like, this is it, stop talking. But I also just don't know where that would leave us. Like, I'm just not quite sure where that would leave the field. Like, I just don't know that it's that relevant. And I'm probably like a bad social scientist to say that, but I'm just not quite sure.
No, you have, like, every scientist has their own viewpoint and their own perspective. So that's completely valid. But on the topic of heavy debates, you mentioned previously that a huge misconception is that emotions are controllable and they are something to control. And this is something I did want to ask a bit further about, because there are a lot of people that do attest to it. So what would you say the difference is between controlling your emotions and managing them, or what's the word, just figuring them out essentially?
I mean, I would just say full stop that we're not in full control of our emotions, right? I mean, I think one of the best findings that we can pull out from some of the folks who agree with the biological perspective that emotions are an innate physiological response is that if we believe that to be the case, that at least part of what creates an emotional response is something that's automatic, that we don't think about, then I think it's impossible to say that we can fully control our emotions, right? Because you can't fully control an innate automatic response to a life event. So again, the bear example, like, I can't control the emotion of fear if I'm confronted with a bear out in the middle of the woods, right? Like, even if I'm able to, after a split second, sort of think myself, talk myself down, cognize about it, like, that immediate response, there's nothing I can do about that, right? So I'd say full stop that we're not in control of our emotions, right? But to be sure, we can manage them. And there are, in fact, like a bunch of studies that provide this evidence that show there are some really reliable strategies that we can use to regulate, to manage our emotions, right? And like, I would just say it's another good example, I guess. Let me just sort of backtrack. Another good example of why we can't control our emotions. Think about times when you had an emotion that was situationally inappropriate. And I think that gives, again, some really good evidence as to why we're not fully in control, right? So did you ever have an experience where your emotion came on at the wrong time or at the wrong level of intensity, right? If you've ever been in a fight with somebody and you started laughing, or if you've been grieving the loss of somebody and you started laughing, or been at a funeral and somebody laughed, right? Like, this, again, I think shows that we can't fully control our emotions, right? There's a lot that we can do to manage them, to understand them, as you've said, but I just don't think there's a way to fully control them.
Yeah, for sure. I've also seen or read a lot about emotion regulation, which is very different. And it's something that, according to various studies, something that people with depression, stress-related illnesses, and neurodevelopmental disorders amongst the list do struggle with. So what is emotion regulation? What happens when we regulate our emotions? How does it work? And is this something that we do naturally?
Right. So emotion regulation is all about our attempts to influence the emotions that we're having, right? So which specific emotion we're having, when we have an emotion, and also how we express or experience them, right? So it's a whole series of stuff that we try to do, perhaps sometimes in vain, to control or to manage our emotions, right? To regulate them, to use the word. So emotion regulation has quite a few benefits, and I think you started to allude to this in the question. Many of those benefits, and we'll talk about this, I think, in a bit, many of those benefits are social in nature, and they allow regulating our emotions successfully allows us to match what we're experiencing and how we experience it, how we express it to a social situation. And that enables us to develop closeness, to develop relationships with people, to show that we're part of the group. When we don't do that, we risk things like embarrassment or social ostracism, right? Not feeling like we're part of the group. So when our emotions are mismatched to what the situation is calling for, right? We're laughing maniacally at a funeral, or we're crying super loudly at a movie where nobody else is crying, right? Like, those kinds of things have real social risks to them. So there's a lot socially to gain. We need this social connection. And so there's a lot socially to gain by regulating our emotions, right? By successfully engaging in this. The other thing that I think is important and so also social in nature is that when we successfully regulate our emotions, again, in a social context, we show that we understand the norms of whatever situation we're in. And maybe more importantly, we show that we understand the norms of the group that we're in. And this allows us to really like curry favor with our mates, right? And like help foster close relationships with them, which again is a hugely important long-term evolutionary goal. So those are really social in nature. I would say one other thing that's important, and it's a little bit more personal in nature, a benefit of emotion regulation is that the strategies that we can use to effectively regulate our emotions are just generally good strategies for coping as well. So one really common one is reappraisal. Like you think differently about a situation. So it's this kind of like silver lining approach, right? Like this seems really bad, but what are the good things about it that I can refocus my attention on? And so those strategies don't just work to help regulate emotions, which they do, but they're just broadly helpful coping strategies, which help us to better deal with the life events that we come across.
Yeah, this when you talked a little bit about us needing that social connection and not being able to regulate our emotions does present some kind of social risk, and that reminds me a bit about how with autism and they have frequent meltdowns regulating with have issues with regulating emotions and therefore have meltdowns, and a lot of the issues in that it's not a problem with them, but more so that we are a very social society where we do need to have that connection, that social connection, in order to function effectively. And that is kind of just a technique that they have to learn to adopt in order to succeed in society, which it's a bit off tangent, but it's just something that I noticed when talking about regulating our emotions, and how you brought up the society, the need for social connection too. And that also shows such a big role that emotion plays in social relationships, because you have to really essentially kind of assess what the appropriate amounts of emotion, or what the appropriate emotion is as well, in order to maintain that social connection, which is so interesting to me. And so with that in mind, when do you think that social connection is important too for our happiness? Because this is also intertwined, right? Like, which comes first, our emotion and then social connection, and then does the social connection lead us to happiness, or do we have to be happy first to get that social connection? What are your thoughts on that?
God, again, another chicken or the egg. You're really good at these chicken or the egg questions, Marie. It's hard to say which is first, right? But clearly, emotions serve this really important social function, and they are one of the best tools we have at our disposal for helping us to carry out and maintain successful social interactions, which, as you said, are essential to survival. I mean, social psychologists have gone as far as to say that social connection is an innate need. Like, in the same way that we need food and water, we need social connection, right? So emotions are one of the most powerful levers we have to pull to be able to maintain those social connections. One stat that I found really insightful, I think, about this is that after about 90% of the emotional episodes that people have, they share that with someone else, right? So 90% of the time we experience an emotion, which we experience frequently throughout the day, right? We share that with someone else. And again, I think that shows the importance of emotions, the degree to which they're at the forefront of many of our interactions and many of our day-to-day kind of movements. That sharing of emotion is actually one of the most important social roles that emotions can play, right? Sharing with somebody in that way helps bring you together with them. It helps us to gather support from our group or from our loved ones when and if we need it, right? So there's a variety of social functions that emotions play. And again, I for some reason came up with lists of 3 here, but I think it's important to highlight 3 of these particular social purposes, right? So
I love lists. So
lists are great, right? Lists are the best.
Yeah.
So one of them is that emotions promote commitment, and commitment to a relationship commitment. And I don't just mean romantic relationships, but commitment to the well-being of another person. Historically, evolutionarily, this committing to someone else represented this sort of weird problem. Like, we knew we needed to be connected to other people in order to survive in, say, the cave people days. But it was also risky to commit to them, right? Because maybe we didn't know them. We didn't know if they were going to like steal our saber-toothed tiger that we just killed or whatever. So we needed commitment, but we weren't necessarily willing to make the commitment. Emotions actually help us to solve this problem. So emotions are one way that we can signal to other people that we care about their well-being, right? Expressing things like empathy to them allows us to show that we care about you, and it can help close this kind of commitment gap, right? Emotions motivate us to act in ways that prioritize other people. And that allows us to create and maintain these kind of social bonds, which as you alluded to, is super important, right? So the second thing is that emotions have this really interesting way of coordinating our action with other people, enabling us to, in a group, act in a way that's going to be the most effective on our environment. And whether that is hunting for saber-toothed tiger or more in my interest domain, there's a lot of studies looking at this, the way that emotion, particularly via touching, can coordinate our actions with other people. And there's been some really cool studies in basketball in particular that look at the relationship between the frequency with which teammates touch each other. So whether it's a high five or pat on the butt or whatever, and the relationship between those touches and their performance. And they find over and over again that teams that touch each other more tend to perform in a more coordinated or successful manner, right? So communicating this, whether it's appreciation, support, whatever it is, communicating in that way via touch shows people and allows us to move with them, coordinate our actions much better with them. The last thing is that emotions are, and I think this is a little bit counterintuitive perhaps, but emotions are a motivator for us to join groups. We know, again, that it's not good to feel lonely or to feel uncertain about our life and about our future. And those are 2 emotions that can serve as motivators to join groups, which again, evolutionarily, we know is hugely important to have that kind of social connection. And I think this is especially interesting. Emotions can tell us about our place in a group. They can tell us about sort of where we stand in the hierarchy of a group. So which emotions somebody's able to express at a given time, how they're able to express them, gives us a hint about where we and the other person stands in the hierarchy of a group. So for example, people that are able to express anger in a group typically are those that are have more seniority or more superiority or higher status, right? Because if you're at the bottom, you're not allowed to be angry, right? You just sort of have to go about your business and sort of figure things out. So they have this interesting way of both motivating us to join a group, as well as showing us where we stand in the hierarchy, which, getting back to our sort of norms idea, is important in showing us how we can continue to curry favor with the group.
Yeah, that is so interesting to me. And, the pursuit of happiness is also a goal that people often strive towards, right? And that is something that people spend most of their lives trying to figure out. Now, what are some of the common missteps that you think people make in this endeavor? Or what do you think are some of the misconceptions they hold with them as well through this journey that don't really help?
I love this question so much, by the way. So I just want to give you props for a good question.
Oh, thank you.
It's so funny because I think actually the biggest mistake people make is getting bogged down in this feeling that we need to seek out to find pure happiness. And what we have now is never enough. And the reality is that that's just not the case. Like, we're actually really, really, really good at manufacturing happiness, that whatever situation we're in, humans have this amazing ability to make some happiness out of it. And, obviously there's some really cool studies that support that idea, but I just find that so fascinating, right? That we're so caught up, as your question alluded to, so caught up in pursuing, seeking, finding happiness. And the reality is we're crappy at predicting what's going to make us happy. And because of that, this seeking out generally doesn't do a very good job. And we're actually just as good at manufacturing and making happiness out of whatever it is that we have already.
Right. Yeah, I can think back to some instances in my life where I felt particularly down, but I had enough social connection, and maybe I didn't realize it then, but that social connection, people that I was in this particular not so great experience with, that was enough to make me happy and enough to sustain me. And maybe it's not the healthiest thing to obviously do this for the long run, but it gave me a form of happiness that might not be what my usual idea of happiness is.
Yeah.
Regardless, it gives me that happiness, and that's only something that I realized upon looking back. In fact, it's something that I only just realized when you were talking to me about that. But what do you think we can learn from this?
I mean, I think we can learn so much, as your example attests, right? I mean, there's these really classic studies from, the early 2000s. There's a pretty famous psychologist named Dan Gilbert, who also appeared in Prudential advertisements here in the States. And he did some really cool studies and presents some of them actually in an amazing TED Talk from 2006 that I still show in my classes, and students are like, why does he have a laptop that looks like this? But anyways, so he did these really cool studies showing that we suck at predicting what's going to make us happy. We think we're good at it, but we're really bad at knowing how future events are going to make us feel. And so we tend to pursue to go after things that on their face we think will make us happy. If I just get that new job, if I just get a little bit more money, if I just have this new pair of jeans, right? We are bad at knowing what's going to make us happy. And so the reality, the data show that we don't need a lot of stuff. We don't need a lot of money to be happy. There's a threshold. I'm sure you've seen this graph, right? It's a certain amount where happiness sort of flattens out, it plateaus, right? So you need enough to be comfortable to be able to do the things you want, but money and happiness are not just infinitely positively correlated, right? They don't just always keep going up, 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 and up. So we can be happy what we have. We can create this manufactured happiness. And I think this gets back to something you said, that manufactured happiness is no different than what we conceive of as true, pure happiness that we've sought out from some, otherworldly event. There's no difference in how it makes us feel. There's no difference in the positive outcomes that it can create in our lives, right? It's not as if pure happiness is better, qualitatively different than this manufactured happiness that you were talking about. They're the same thing, right? They are clearly the same thing, and both are good. Both have lots of benefits to us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just as you're saying that, I was also thinking, well, with things like new jobs or new money that maybe will provide us with some happiness, there are some downsides to it that people don't really take into account. For example, having more also means you have more to lose. What goes up can come down, and you can live in a state of fear about losing it as well. So with that happiness comes a bit of fear as well about having to go back to the life that you had before. And that's not trying to diminish any kind of issue that people are going through, but it's definitely a multifaceted I guess experience that people kind of perceive to be only one-sided, only just pure happiness. And that's really interesting. Now, for those who want to learn more about understanding our emotions, especially from a psychology perspective, from a perspective of psychology. Are there any resources or tools that you'd recommend?
So I was thinking about this primarily in the context of our happiness discussion, because people want to know about the sort of nexus of emotions and whatever. But a lot of times the sort of popular stuff about happiness is, quite frankly, misses the mark. And so I wanted to highlight two things about happiness that I thought that do a nice job of presenting some of the data from positive psychology in particular in a way that's really accessible. So two books. One is an old but really good book by the guy I mentioned, Dan Gilbert. It's called Stumbling on Happiness. And again, gets into this idea that manufactured or stumbled upon happiness, it is just as good as this happiness that we're constantly pursuing. The second is a book by another social psychologist named Dacher Keltner, who's actually here at University of California, Berkeley, just up the road from me. And this is a newer book. I haven't read it yet, so I'm plugging it anyways. It's supposed to be good. Excuse me. It's called Awe, the Transformative Power of Everyday Wonder. And so he is synthesizing a bunch of research on awe, the emotion of awe, and how powerful of a influence it can be in a positive way on our lives. And so I haven't read that one, but it seems really interesting, and it's certainly on the list of books I want to read.
Yeah, amazing. We'll link those in the show notes. And don't worry, we won't fault you at all if we end up not liking the book. You haven't read it, so that's fair warning. Now we'll move on to the practices and habits section. This is where we ask you a bit more about the everyday application of what you've just shared with us. And now, to start, what is a habit that you recommend practicing to regulate our emotions?
Okay, this sounds so cliche, but it's true, and the data back me up. So mindfulness. Mindfulness really works. There's a huge body of literature on mindfulness now. A lot of managing our emotions is about short-circuiting these kind of automatic responses that we have to situations, right? Or at least catching them before they can escalate too much. So mindfulness practice, which of course can take a bunch of different forms, can help us develop this kind of emotion recognition skill, right? To know, okay, I'm responding in an overly angry way to this situation. How can I rein this in maybe more quickly than I would otherwise? Something else that is aligned with mindfulness, but that's slightly different, and something actually I've been dabbling in lately, is hypnotherapy. And again, there are some good data. It sounds kind of woo-woo, but like there are some good data behind the use of hypnotherapy, in particular for a variety of different conditions. But it also focuses on this kind of mindful awareness of what's going on in our lives. And so, again, cliche, but that is absolutely a data-backed recommendation.
Yeah, I've always been really curious to know a bit more about hypnotherapy because it does sound pretty woo. So would you mind elaborating a little bit? Tell us a bit about hypnotherapy and what that entails.
So I am doing it. This is probably a TMI moment, but I'm doing it because I have a chronic gut condition. And there's an app, really user-friendly app developed actually at Monash University, which I think is in Australia, by some researchers, some IBS, irritable bowel syndrome researchers, applying hypnotherapy to IBS. And so they developed this really cool 6-week program. And I've been doing it on my phone every night before bed. So the idea behind hypnotherapy is that you get into this super relaxed state. And then once you're in this deeply relaxed, deeply mindful space, you're delivered with suggestions about sort of how you should think, how you should act, kind of trying to change your automatic cognitions, your automatic thoughts about a particular behavior, emotion, response, whatever it might be. So in my case, and in the case of this app called Nerva, it's about changing the relationship between our brain and our gut and just kind of dialing down our emotions and our kind of stress response in that domain.
That's really interesting. And no shame with the TMI at all. We do enjoy good TMI moments here. But we most importantly do appreciate you sharing that with us because you didn't need to at all. But we did take something away from that. So we do appreciate it. Now we're moving on to the open mic section. This is where you get an opportunity to talk about anything that you're passionate about that doesn't have to be related to the topic. But if you want to do that, that's a free reign. The floor is all yours. So please take it away.
Okay, so not exactly related to emotion. Most of my personal research and one of my passions is in health communication, health messaging. We were talking about this a lot throughout COVID, of course, about getting vaccinations or wearing masks or whatever. And the point I want to make to use my open mic is that we have to stop making crappy health public service announcements. Over the course, and I only unfortunately know about what's happened in the US primarily, but over the course of the last, call it 40 or 50 years, the US government has spent, I almost said wasted, but spent billions of dollars with a B, creating and disseminating health messages that generally either fail or at worst backfire. So some of the most famous anti-drug campaigns aimed at kids, trying to get kids to not smoke pot, not drink or whatever, actually backfired. That's what the big studies of them show. And the feds actually sat on these data for a long time because they didn't want anybody to know that their campaign was so shitty. So it failed, right? It backfired. So that's a bad thing. This has been true across a variety of contexts. So drugs, vaccinations, texting and drinking, texting and driving, whatever. Texting and driving and drinking and driving is what I meant to say. The list goes on, right? So at various domains, there are a bunch of reasons for why these campaigns have failed, why they have come up short. People that design them had the best of intentions, right? This is not a willful negligence. They meant to design crappy campaigns kind of thing. But the campaigns have largely been designed by people who have no background in the science of persuasion. They don't know anything about how to change people's attitudes. Instead, they base their campaigns on what they think will work, right? Gut feelings. They come up with these ads. Usually it's like a bunch of old white guys. They come up with these ads, and then they're like, this will work on those teenagers, without testing them with teenagers, without thinking about studying the science of persuasion, which has been around for 100 years, right? People have been thinking about what makes a good persuasive message, how to change people's attitudes for many, many years. So my stand is that we need to stop making these crappy PSAs. There is a new framework that's come out that I think is really helpful in this regard. So I'm not just going to propose a problem. I want to also propose a solution. There's a really helpful new framework that came out in this regard, and I am lucky to know the two people that came out with it. Two of my mentors, doctors Bill Crano and Jason Siegel, who work at the university where I got my Ph.D. They came up with this idea that there are common things that could be used, common tactics that could be used in persuasive messages to to increase the likelihood that they were effective, that their targets actually engaged with them, that their targets actually paid attention to them, processed them, thought about them, and ultimately were persuaded by them. And so I would happily provide more resources about this, more detail on the framework. But that's the idea, that the resources are available, they're out there, that the people are out there who've thought about this stuff, and our influence, our knowledge, our understanding of human behavior and persuasion needs to be tapped in this context. We're seeing, huge fentanyl crises in the US. We're seeing crises of all kinds of other things that wouldn't be solved by better health messaging, but could at least be somewhat addressed by using better health messaging. So that's my open mic drop.
That's a fantastic use of the open mic. Thank you so much for sharing that. I believe many people would benefit from that. So we do appreciate it. And thank you so much for joining us today, Ben. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. Sadly, I'm a dinosaur when it comes to social media, all that stuff. So probably the best way to get hold of me is via email. You can also check out my lab website. So I run a small lab called the Health and Motivation Lab, Folks can find me there or at the website for my newest endeavor, which is called the Institute for Interdisciplinary Health Research. So any of those ways would be fantastic ways to get hold of me.
Amazing. We'll link this in the show notes. Thank you once again, Ben, for joining us today. It's been such an insightful and engaging conversation. I learned so much from you, and I hope our listeners have learned that much too. Now, thank you so much everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
You've been listening to the Self-Improvement Atlas, the Personal Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. For more episodes like this from 10 different life management perspectives, search LMSL on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you can get updated on everything we have to offer. We have a wide range of topics readily available for you to check out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pe.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.